Hey everybody, how's it going? Decided to go ahead and do my first tier list for One Piece card game. This is my pre-Treasure Cup tier list based on all of the playtesting that I've done and seeing how everything kind of plays through. A lot of these leaders are super strong in their own right, and I think there's a lot of decks that have the potential to go pretty far and make a lot of noise. So without further ado, I'm going to get right into it. So, first up, we're going to start with Blue Purple Kaido. I think this deck is a tier 2 deck. The reason why I think it's a tier 2 deck is because though it has all of the strengths that purple has, you are starting the game with one less life, and I don't think the addition of blue is strong enough to the purple engine as it already exists to justify playing this leader over just the straight purple Kaido. I think it's strong. I think there are merits to why it's strong, being able to add extra Dawn, maybe not even play Onigashima Island and just play additional ramp cards. But I don't think that it has that same potential that the high roll of that purple Kaido with Onigashima Island has. You know, the very standard turn 3 looks a lot different for Purple Kaido. Moving on to Blue Crocodile. Crocodile's, pretty great. However, I think he has a pretty hefty price to pay in a deck with no ramp cards. So if you're not using his effect to finish the game, you're likely using it to save your life, and spending that much Dawn just to save your life generally means that you're struggling in the game. I think that this deck is a worse version of the Doflamingo deck. I think that it's also a worse version of Blue Purple Crocodile. And I think that, being able to bounce a single card late game to finish it off may have been good when just the starter decks were out, but there's a lot more options, and I think Doflamingo does a better job of keeping card advantage than Crocodile does. And his effect is basically useless until you're using it to remove cards from the play. So that's why I think it's tier 2. I think it's tier 2 because blue is such a strong color in general. Lots of 2K counters, lots of great counter cards, counter event cards. So that's why I'm placing Crocodile in tier 2. Moving forward to Blue Purple Crocodile. This is a deck that I feel has a lot of potential to do well against two of the stronger decks in the format. I think Blue Purple Crocodile is a really great matchup into Kaido, Purple Kaido, and he's a really good matchup into Red Green Law, as well as just Captain Kid, because of the ability to consistently just, take that pressure off from your opponent, and then being able to just kind of slap back and eventually stall them out, and being able to deal a card with Banish consistently on the board while being able to also use your event cards for free means that if you can get a Crocodile out and protect him, the opponent has really no way of answering him, except for like an Otama and a Jet Pistol. That's the only way to deal with him for a red side. That's why he can have a rough matchup into like Zoro and Luffy, as well as, Law when they do the Otama and the Jet Pistol combo. But again, if you can get your Crocodile out and they cannot deal with him, he's such a great card and he does so much work. And then being able to be consistently topped off on your hand, usually you're having 5 cards in hand no matter how much you're blowing through. Being able to play all of the 2K counters, not just from blue, but from purple, and have them all be relevant cards as well in your hand is so nice. And then again, the addition of Desert Spada, Love Beam, Blast Breath, all super great counter cards that are relatively cheap and provide a pretty huge effective counter to your characters. Being able to swing at over 9k or over 11k after swinging at your suspended crocodiles, it's really hard for a lot of decks to do. So you're able to stall out really early, and if you can get a Crocodile out and protect it, you're doing pretty good. This deck does struggle against Doflamingo because Doflamingo, I think if they're hitting their Peronas and their 3-cost Doflamingos, they're able to effectively deal with your board. And they have big bodies in Dracule and Doflamingo, the 7-drop, that can actually swing over your Crocodile fairly easily late game, as well as bouncing your blockers back to hand. Again, in this deck is fairly, consequential. Decks that can pop them are fine because you can at least get event cards back from Missile Sunday, but having them blocked is pretty annoying for this deck. Next up is Doflamingo, and I actually think this is a tier 1 deck, strictly because you're going to be mulliganing until you see a Perona or a 3-cost Doflamingo in your hand. And if you do see those cards in your hand, this deck can hit the nuts super easily. Being able to rearrange your deck to always have a 4-cost coming out teaches super good early to bounce your characters. Boa Hancock, again, another blocker that's super fantastic to have out. that can draw you cards, get a lot of card advantage in this deck. You're playing blue, so you have naturally a lot of 2K counters and things like Love Beam. Again, just so much advantage that this deck can generate. It's crazy. It's crazy how much advantage that it can generate. I actually play against this deck pretty frequently, and there are games obviously where you don't get those cards to rearrange top 5 cards of your deck and you're feeling pretty bad. But if you're good and you can remember what you're laying down, this deck has infinite potential, and it has really good top end cards like Dracula and Doflamingo. Being able to bottom deck something is super impactful, and being able to swing over the bigger cards is also really, really nice. So Doflamingo, super great leader right now. I think it has a lot of flexibility, and it's a very good mid-range deck. Next up, I'm going to bring out Kaido. I think Kaido is one of the best decks in the format right now. It is one of those decks that if you could open an Onigashima Island, it is just one of the hardest ramping decks and one of the harder decks to deal with. It has an answer for almost every single deck in the format. It can answer the big bodies from blue, red, and green with the board wipe Kaido. It can answer a lot of the decks like to flood the board with the 6 and 7 drop kings. It has access to a lot of blockers, and most decks can play almost 20 2K counters in purple, as well as having access to Blast Breath and Brachio Bomber. Also, the ability to trash your opponent's life with no detriment really if you're late game going for game. It's just one of those cards that is super impactful, and I think Kaido is like sleeper to potentially be one of the best decks at Treasure Cup. I think it's one of the harder decks to pilot because it can be very punishing if you make a misplay, since you are minusing your Dawn. But this deck, if it hits the right cards, it has infinite potential and can likely take over a match. And with best of ones, I mean, you just have to mulligan for Onigashima Island and you're having a great time. Next up is Kid. I think that Kid is going to be the most represented deck at the Treasure Cup. From what we've seen at a lot of the tournaments going on right now, Kid is the highest played deck. It's not super expensive to build. I think your most expensive card is Trafalgar Law. Outside from the Star deck cards, some decks can play more expensive variations playing Yamato. But running the Wano package and the Supernovas package, this deck has the ability to search a lot and generate a lot of card advantage, and I think it's a hard matchup for a lot of decks that like to chip away. If you can get an 8-cost Kid out and protect him, there is so much ability that you have to just out-ramp your opponent, and again, just beat them in the card advantage game. You have access to a lot of blockers, you have access to a lot of great counter cards that are super effective, and you also have the ability to get a lot of aggressive swings in with your leader. Getting 2 swings and forcing your opponent to burn cards early game is super great. So that's why I think Kid is a bit better than Kaido. I think it's a lot easier to pilot than Kaido, but I do think Kaido has higher top-end potential than Kid does. But I think for the most of the player base, Kid is cool where it is right now. For our next leader, it's King. This card is awful. It is the worst leader in the game currently, I think. I think it's so bad. Having your effect not come online until you're at 10 Dawn in a deck that likes to minus Dawn is really awful. And not only that though, but you have to play around his effect to get the most value out of even playing him as a leader over Kaido. So you can't really use a lot of your cards that do minus Dawn if you don't have an Onigashima Island out. And then on top of that, if you play a card to minus a Dawn when you're on your 10 Dawn turn and you don't have a way of recuperating it, his effect just doesn't work. So it's one of those cards that I think there's no reason to ever play it, and if you are playing it, it's basically a meme. Next up, we have Kinemon, and I'm a little bit torn on where to put Kinemon. I think he probably belongs at the very bottom of tier 2, maybe tier 3. It's hard to say. Sorry, Kazuki Oden, not Kinemon, my bad. But yeah, Kazuki Oden, I think it's one of those cards that, while it is strong being able to active your 2 Dawn, I think it does fall behind a little bit in aggression compared to like the Captain Kid deck. And being able to get those early swings in with your leader, especially in certain matchups where you don't need to play anything, you don't need to put bodies out to get 2 swings in, is fairly important, especially in matchups against purple. I think that the Odin deck can really struggle against things like the Rush decks, things like the Kaido deck and the Doflamingo deck, things that can get a lot of bodies out really quickly, and them not having ways to deal with it early can be pretty consequential for them. I think that, again, Kid is just a better version of it in every way. There are obviously a lot of Wano cards that you can use. I think that playing both the Wano and the Supernova's engine is what you do in this deck, but is his effect that much better than Kid's? No, it's way worse. Activating Tudon for pitching a card, would you rather active Tudon or would you rather get 2 swings in with your leader? You can always load up your leader Kid late game and swing twice, and it's really hard for people to counter that, especially in the late game. Having a leader Kid with 7 Dawn attached, swinging for 12k, and then swinging again for 12k. Most decks can't handle that if there's no blockers on board. So you don't have to have that kind of mindfulness when playing against Kazuki Odin. So that's why I have him in the bottom of tier 2 here. Next up, we have Trafalgar Law. And this might be a bit controversial, but I think that Trafalgar Law is one of the best decks in the format, if not the best deck in the format. It's one of those decks that requires a ton of skill to pilot, but it's also one of the decks that has the most high roll potential, in my opinion. Though it does have the detriment of having 4 life, it is one of those decks that you can just take over a game and just beat your opponent to the ground with card advantage. I think the reason why it's not the best deck in the format is because of its difficulty to play. While you can have games where you're just absolutely popping off with Law, it's knowing how to play the games where you don't, or you are in a disadvantageous position, that make or break the Law player. As someone who's played a lot of games as Trafalgar Law, I can tell you it's one of the hardest decks to pilot. And while I really enjoy playing with him, I don't know if it's even worth taking to Treasure Cup if you're not the absolute best you can be on the deck and you figured out every single thing about the deck. Otherwise, if you want to have a similar level of aggression, you could just play Captain Kid or Zoro, which are decks that both represent a lot of aggression with their rush cards and their ability to have high attack characters come out of nowhere. So that's my opinion on Law. I do see Law take first in a lot of events, which is why I think he's rated so highly for me. But again, I think he's one of those cards that really needs to just be highly proficient, and you need to spend a lot of time on the deck to be really good at it. Next up is Red Green Luffy, and for me, I think it's tier 3. I think it's one of those decks that Law does everything that it wants to do better. Law can even play a card that does the exact same thing as Luffy does, and still be able to bounce cards and play cards for free. So yeah, Luffy's ability to restand cards is the same effect as the starter deck Super Rare Law, which a lot of Trafalgar Law decks play already. And being able to restand your characters, you can just use your Law's effect to bounce to play the starter deck Law to restand. Luffy's effect costs way more, and it's way more situational than the Trafalgar Law effect, where you could just bounce for 2 cost instead of for 4 cost and play it. So yeah, again, just a way worse version of Law that also has the detriment of playing with 4 life. Pretty straightforward. Up next, I have Luffy, and I believe Luffy sits comfortably in tier 1.5. I think Luffy is a more control-oriented style of deck than the Zoro deck is, and I think that Luffy is very strong at controlling the board and getting a lot of big bodies out. I think you want to play more of the vanillas in this deck, because you can just give Rested Dawn to those characters. I'm talking, Nefertari, I'm talking Sunny-kun, I'm talking, all those vanilla cards, because being able to give, Rested Dawn to your cards, as well as your Rush Luffy's and your Zoros, is super impactful, and, you'll be able to swing over a lot of stuff, as well as, generate, a lot of removal cards like, Jet Pistol and Red Hawk. So a deck that plays similar to Zoro, but different, and I don't think it has a ton of detriment, but I think Zoro is better at being more aggressive, and I think Luffy's better at playing more reactively. And last up, we have Red Zoro here. I think Zoro probably belongs at the top of 1.5. I don't know if it is a tier 1 deck, in my opinion, just because it struggles against purple way too much to be a super relevant deck, I think. It has a tough time dealing with the blocker queens. I think it has a tough time dealing with the ramp. There's no way of protecting your characters in red other than blockers, and falling victim to things like the 7-drop and the 6-drop king, as well as the rush Kaido and the board wipe Kaido, is really tough for Luffy to deal with, because your big cards like Shanks are easily dealt with by the 10-drop Kaido. So you have to play really careful against purple. And I think against Kid as well. Kid can weather the storm fairly well against Zoro. Lots of blockers, lots of way to suspend characters, lots of way of dealing with those rush characters, as well as, you know, just having the aggression of your leader to be able to swing over dudes that are playing, makes it a hard matchup for the Zoro deck. So that's why I think it's 1.5. I think it has favorable matchups in the mirror against, it's a good deck against Law. It's good against Blue because, again, you can play a lot of rush guys to swing over what Doflamingo is playing, so they can't generate card advantage, or they're forced to blow their hand to protect the characters they're playing off the Doflamingo effect. But I think, again, it struggles against green and purple, which are two of the best decks in the format. It has a fairly even matchup against Law, and a losing matchup, I would say, against Doflamingo as well. Or, sorry, a good matchup against Doflamingo, a losing matchup against Kaido. It probably doesn't do too well against the Blurple Crocodile either, because they could just, again, weather the storm and then get those 7 drops out and then protect them, because, you know, you have to load up your Shanks to swing over them, and then they can just love being Desert Spada or play one of the 16 2K counters. So I think that's where I'm going to put Zoro. But that's the end of the tier list. I think it's a pretty straightforward tier list right now. There's not a ton of leaders that are, you know, available for play yet, and I think that right now the game is in a pretty balanced state. And I think that you could probably have a pretty solid performance on any of the leaders in tier 1 to 2. 3 and meme obviously is not playable, I don't think, in the current format. But I think you could take any of the leaders in tier 1, 1.5, or 2 to the Treasure Cup and have success with them. Obviously, if you're better at playing a certain style, or if a leader fits your style better, then, you know, go for it. But I do think that the top 4 decks in this format are going to be Law, Kid, Kaido, and Doflamingo. And then anything else could be, there's lots of chances for dark horses. So let me know your thoughts. Let me know what you think. If you have any questions, or you think that I'm totally crazy with my predictions, let me know. I will be releasing a video after the Treasure Cup with my thoughts on how everything went, with my thoughts on the meta, as well as my updated tier list based on what I play against. It is a 512 person event, and I'm interested to seeing the results across the globe when it comes to the TCG and not the OCG. So if you like the video, please make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, Monty out.